You have likely detected a disturbing sensation as you navigate your daily existence. It is not necessarily that individuals are baffling, but rather that they are fundamentally erratic. A person might claim to hold deep affection for you, yet their subsequent choices quietly signal a retreat. Someone may pledge their unwavering devotion, only to vanish the very second a situation becomes burdensome. Others will offer a warm grin, vocalize their agreement, and provide comfort, only to later behave as though those shared moments possess no significance at all. Furthermore, the most agonizing aspect of this experience is not the act of being misled itself. It is that heavy realization that you remained entirely unaware of the impending shift. The vast majority of people move through their lives under the false impression that they possess a keen grasp of human nature. They pay attention to spoken claims, they place their confidence in various justifications, and they operate under the premise that everyone harbors noble motives. Consequently, they find themselves blindsided by reality over and over again. This occurs not because of a lack of intelligence or a deficiency in character, but because society fails to provide a genuine education on the actual mechanics of human conduct. This narrative was crafted for that specific purpose, recognizing that individuals rarely disclose their authentic selves through direct communication. Instead, they broadcast their true nature through subtle recurring habits, emotional reflexes, periods of quiet, the pacing of their choices, and their responses to external stress. The fundamental reality is uncomplicated yet difficult to accept. Spoken language is frequently a stage display, whereas actual conduct is almost never an accident. Human beings tend to articulate whatever sounds most favorable at the moment. They speak to safeguard their reputation or to ensure their future possibilities remain unblocked. However, physical action is where the truth inevitably escapes. You might detect genuine feeling in the sound of a voice, but you can only truly confirm its existence through a pattern of steady behavior. While you can choose to believe an explanation, you can only truly rely on the weight of repetition. Once you embrace this perspective, a profound internal shift occurs. You no longer find yourself overanalyzing every minor dialogue, nor do you spend your nights revisiting past encounters to find a missing clue. You cease the habit of blaming yourself for a lack of perception, because true insight is not a supernatural gift, it is simply the result of refined and disciplined observation. This exploration is not intended to teach deception or the exercise of power over others, nor does it encourage a life of emotional distance. Rather, it focuses on the attainment of absolute transparency. It is about mastering the art of watching without imposing your own desires on what you see. It involves learning to hear what is said without letting it cloud your judgment, and seeing people for who they truly are rather than for who you wish they would become. The majority of interpersonal friction does not stem from a desire to cause harm, but from the error of projection. You tend to assume that others process thoughts just as you do, that their moral compass aligns with your own, and that truthfulness is a standard human trait. Nevertheless, the engine of human activity does not run on these assumptions. It is fueled by personal gains, intense feelings, deep-seated anxieties, and routine behaviors. The sooner you recognize this reality, the more secure and composed you will become. A profound sense of quiet strength accompanies the ability to read those around you. When you possess the skill to decode actions, the need for constant verbal validation simply evaporates. When you can identify the underlying architecture of someone's emotions, you no longer find yourself desperately seeking answers that will never come. By focusing on reactions instead of rhetoric, the fog of uncertainty begins to lift. You move away from the frustrated question of why someone acted a certain way and arrive at a place where their choices seem entirely expected. This transition is not born of resentment, but of a grounded and realistic perspective. Throughout this journey, we will examine the concealed internal systems that dictate how people think, how they protect their egos, and how they inadvertently expose their true character. You will discover why an immediate emotional reflex is more revealing than a rehearsed speech, why a moment of silence often carries a heavier message than 1,000 words, and why a high-pressure environment strips away a facade much faster than a life of ease. Furthermore, you will understand why the person who remains still and watches will always perceive more than the person who is swept up in the heat of the moment. This process also requires you to look inward and address something quite profound. The reason we often fail to judge others accurately is not solely due to their complexity, but due to our own internal filters. We tend to fill in the gaps of a person's character with our own virtues and interpret their movements through the lens of our personal desires. Once you recognize this innate tendency to project, you obtain a rare advantage: the capacity to pull back, to witness instead of reacting, and to analyze instead of taking things personally. You essentially choose the path of certainty over the path of confusion. As these concepts unfold, I encourage you to avoid the urge to hurry. Allow these recurring themes to settle into your mind and permit the various scenarios to resonate with your own lived history. This material is not designed to simply add to your knowledge. It is an analytical tool intended for your psychological protection. By the conclusion of this study, you will no longer categorize individuals as simply virtuous or villainous. Instead, you will recognize them as predictable entities. Once a person's behavior becomes something you can anticipate, the chaos of emotional turmoil loses its power over your life. You find that you have no need to dominate others or engage in constant conflict, nor do you feel the urge to explain your every move. You merely need to perceive the world with clarity, for that steady and unshakable vision is the true foundation of personal influence. Chapter 1: The Performance of the Self. The majority of people live under the conviction that they are acting with total authenticity. They believe their character is a unique creation, their perspectives are entirely their own, and their actions are a direct mirror of their inner spirit. Yet, if you take a moment to decelerate and watch with a neutral eye, devoid of personal feelings, you start to uncover an unsettling truth. Most individuals are not simply existing, they are putting on a show. From our earliest years, we are taught a silent but powerful lesson that dictates the rhythm of nearly every social contact: the warmth of others is based on conditions. To be accepted, one must meet certain standards, and to belong, one must constantly refine their presentation. Consequently, people undergo a process of constant adaptation. They monitor the responses of those around them and experiment with different personas. They quickly identify which versions of themselves result in praise and which ones lead to isolation. In time, these calculated shifts cease to feel like a temporary mask and begin to solidify into permanent habits. Eventually, these habits are mistaken for an actual identity. What you frequently meet in your daily life is not a person in their raw state, but the character they feel obligated to portray. This is the universal social shield that everyone carries. Every unique environment offers rewards for different traits. In a professional setting, a show of certainty is prized even when it lacks substance, while in private connections, a pleasant demeanor is encouraged even if it hides the truth. Within social groups, qualities like wit, influence, or charm become the primary tools of survival. Thus, individuals adopt various facades. They modify their speech depending on their audience, often softening their convictions, inflating their triumphs, or burying their insecurities. They meticulously calibrate their vocal tone, their physical carriage, and their facial expressions to harmonize with the environment. This should not be viewed as an act of malice, it is a mechanism for survival. As fundamentally communal beings, humans exist in social structures that often penalize raw honesty if it threatens collective peace or personal standing. Consequently, the majority of people opt for security over transparency. They prefer the comfort of integration to the risk of individuality, and they would rather be well-liked than truly understood. The tragedy is not the existence of the mask itself, but the tendency to eventually forget that the costume is distinct from the soul. Furthermore, we must recognize why verbal communication serves as the least reliable indicator of truth. When a person describes their character to you, they are frequently presenting the ideal version of themselves they wish for the world to witness. Spoken language is a conscious effort. It is refined, filtered, and strategically structured. People frame their lives in ways that insulate their ego, emphasizing their noble intentions while ignoring their actual habits. They weave narratives designed to excuse their conduct rather than illuminate it. For this reason, placing your full trust in speech alone inevitably results in deep uncertainty. You may encounter someone who speaks of the sanctity of truth but retreats from every difficult dialogue, or someone who vows steadfastness yet vanishes when the pressure mounts. These discrepancies do not imply that people are inherently malicious. They simply demonstrate that human beings are deeply inconsistent, particularly when their self-concept is at stake. Conversely, physical conduct is significantly more difficult to fabricate over an extended period. Actual behavior serves as an involuntary admission of truth, leaking out in small, recurring instances. It is visible in how an individual reacts when they are denied their desires, how they carry themselves when they believe no eyes are upon them, and how they interact with those who possess no status or leverage. These revealing moments require no oratory or justification because they are instinctive. While speech is the product of a goal, behavior is the product of internal wiring. It uncovers the default settings a person falls back on when they are no longer actively managing their reputation. Hence, the seasoned student of human nature rarely inquires about what was said. They instead ask what was done and with what frequency. There is, admittedly, a seductive ease in accepting a performance at face value. Many people find the act comforting because it preserves their sense of optimism and allows them to avoid painful realizations. Viewing actions through a generous lens feels more compassionate than dissectingly analyzing motives. However, this peace of mind carries a heavy price. When you prioritize the role over the recurring pattern, you fundamentally misjudge the person before you. You find ways to forgive contradictions and rationalize glaring warnings, assuming a simple misunderstanding where a consistent signal actually exists. Then, when the facade finally crumbles, the impact feels like a sudden shock, even though the reality had been manifesting itself in plain sight for quite some time. Recognizing that most people are playing a part is not an invitation to cynicism. It is a prerequisite for accuracy. One can learn to observe these dynamics without becoming emotionally detached or cold. Witnessing a performance does not necessitate a confrontation or an accusation. You do not even need to pull away from the relationship. You simply need to maintain a state of active awareness. Take note of what shifts when the environment becomes stressful, what remains constant across different settings, and how a person reacts when they lose the ability to control the story. Genuine character only truly surfaces when the energy required to maintain the mask becomes too great to sustain. This style of observation fosters a profound sense of tranquility. You no longer find yourself pursuing clarity through endless debates or demanding verbal proof. You allow conduct to speak at its own natural volume. As you adopt this habit, a subtle transformation occurs within. You become less prone to sudden reactions or emotional turbulence. This is not because you have stopped caring, but because your vision has expanded. The majority of people are drained by the constant struggle of misinterpreting those around them. They spend hours dissecting old conversations, analyzing vocal inflections, and doubting their own instincts. Usually, the problem is not a lack of intelligence, but rather a misdirection of focus. Once you redirect your attention from words to recurring actions, the grip of confusion begins to loosen. You stop attempting to solve the puzzle of a personality through dialogue alone, allowing time and consistency to reveal what the tongue attempts to obscure. This perspective does not isolate you, it grounds you. It empowers you to engage with others without falling for illusions, to build connections without self-deception, and to value observation over blind hope. In a world defined by theater, this level of awareness is exceptionally rare. While others are preoccupied with their performance, the observer is quietly gaining a deep understanding, a steady, objective clarity that is the bedrock of reading others without being manipulated by them. Chapter 2: The Revelation of Habit. While words are easily manipulated, behavior is remarkably stubborn. This is perhaps the most vital principle to grasp if you wish to perceive people with total transparency. Humans communicate with a specific intent, often filtering their speech through layers of apprehension, desire, and the need for self-preservation. Actions, however, arise from the bedrock of habit. They manifest in the moments when conscious thought pauses and instinct takes the lead. This is precisely why behavior exposes what speech works so tirelessly to hide. When someone narrates their life to you, they are presenting a story. When they show you their life through their actions, they are presenting a pattern. And patterns are incapable of dishonesty. Many people wrongly assume that truth is located in language, so they listen intently to promises, excuses, and heartfelt apologies. They believe that if they can just talk things through, they will find clarity. Yet, the human psyche is exceptionally talented at inventing justifications for its actions after the fact. Language is frequently utilized to soothe discomfort rather than to provide an honest look at the soul. Behavior, meanwhile, requires no explanation. It simply persists. A person might claim to be overwhelmed yet always find a window for the things they truly value. They might profess deep concern while consistently failing to act. They might swear loyalty yet disappear the moment the winds change. None of these situations require complex interpretation. They simply require the courage to observe what is actually happening. The space between an individual's speech and their physical manifestation is the most illuminating territory in the study of human nature. This disconnect is rarely a matter of chance. Rather, it emerges whenever a person's idealized self-concept meets the harsh reality of their deep-seated habits. It is the friction point where aspiration collides with inconvenience. People tend to speak from the perspective of the person they wish they were, but they act from the perspective of the person they have spent years practicing to be. This fundamental distinction is why a verbal promise can feel entirely persuasive in a single moment, yet leave you feeling hollow as the weeks pass. Spoken language exists in the immediate present, whereas true character only unveils itself through the passage of time. Consequently, if you seek a genuine understanding of another, you must shift your focus away from the intensity of their declarations and toward the regularity of their conduct. While high-impact emotion can be performed on demand, true consistency cannot be faked. Furthermore, we must recognize that justifications serve as a form of psychological camouflage. When actions fail to mirror stated intentions, explanations inevitably follow, but these are not random occurrences. They function as intellectual distractions designed to pull your focus away from a recurring habit and back toward a convenient narrative. These reasons often sound entirely plausible. They pull at your sense of compassion and encourage you to offer the benefit of the doubt. While a singular mishap may warrant such grace, a pattern of excuses transforms them from simple explanations into significant warnings. Frequent justifications are essentially confessions made without conscious awareness. An individual who is perpetually behind schedule will always possess a compelling reason, just as someone who avoids accountability will always provide a complex context, and those who overstep boundaries will always defend their core intentions. Ultimately, the logical merit of the excuse is secondary. The only thing that holds weight is whether the conduct actually evolves. If the habit remains unchanged, the explanation is essentially meaningless. True insight is often found not in dramatic gestures, but in the subtle nuances of daily interaction. While many people watch for grand betrayals or explosive arguments, human nature is more accurately revealed through microscopic behaviors. These tiny signals speak softly but with profound authority. You can learn more about a person's emotional maturity, their sense of entitlement, or their capacity for respect by watching how they handle a sudden change in plans or a minor inconvenience than you ever could through a long conversation. It is nearly impossible for someone to consistently lie through their habits, as these are formed over long periods and reinforced without conscious thought. They serve as a map of an individual's internal hierarchy of values, regardless of their outward presentation. If someone truly prizes your presence, their actions will naturally gravitate toward you. If they do not, a quiet distance will inevitably form, often without a single word being spoken. The difficulty most people face is not an inability to see these behaviors, but a resistance to accepting what those behaviors signify. Conduct demands a conclusion, whereas spoken words offer the luxury of hope. To accept a person's actions at face value often requires letting go of their perceived potential or the future you had envisioned with them. To avoid this pain, many choose to rationalize the behavior away, assuming there must be a misunderstanding or waiting for that one perfect conversation that will finally bridge the gap between promises and reality. However, true alignment is never the product of a discussion, it is the result of a fundamental choice. That choice is only ever visible through sustained action. Developing this level of perception does not require you to become confrontational or to constantly point out the contradictions in others. You do not need to expose their inconsistencies or demand they explain themselves. Instead, you simply need to cultivate the habit of noticing. This process is internal and quiet. It does not trigger defensiveness or escalate tension in your relationships. It simply grants you the clarity to adjust your own expectations without the exhausting task of trying to change someone else. This is the practical application of emotional intelligence. You stop reacting to what is said and begin responding to what is proven. By allowing patterns to inform your boundaries and guide your trust, you do not become detached, you become precise. Ultimately, prioritizing behavior over rhetoric leads to a profound sense of psychological liberation. The fog of second-guessing and the endless search for explanations begin to dissipate. You no longer take someone else's inconsistency as a personal failure. Instead, you see the reality of their character with total objectivity. You recognize that some people are fundamentally steady, while others are entirely dependent on their circumstances or their own convenience. This realization does not require anger or judgment, only a calm awareness. This awareness provides you with a rare kind of freedom from the cycle of false optimism and the emotional exhaustion of being swayed by eloquent speech that lacks a foundation in reality. While words have the power to move us, behavior is what tells the truth. Once you learn to interpret that truth with a steady heart, people cease to be a source of confusion. You see them clearly, and in that clarity, you find your power. Chapter 3: The Architecture of Impulse. An individual often reveals more about their internal world in a single second of raw emotion than they do in a lifetime of carefully prepared explanations. This occurs because emotional reflexes are almost never premeditated. They surge to the surface before the conscious mind has the opportunity to filter the response or protect the social mask. In those fleeting windows of irritation, defensiveness, or anxiety, the underlying structure of a person's character becomes starkly visible. It is essential to understand that emotion is not a sign of instability, it is a profound source of data. The majority of individuals fail to comprehend emotional reflexes because they evaluate them through a moral lens rather than a psychological one. They categorize responses as either virtuous or shameful, fitting or unseemly, rather than posing the far more illuminating question: what internal structure is this reaction designed to safeguard? Every visceral response serves as a barricade for something deep within the psyche. When a person exhibits a level of fury that seems entirely disconnected from the provocation, it is a signal that an essential part of their world is under threat. When someone retreats into defensiveness, a brittle self-image has likely been disturbed. Similarly, when an individual emotionally disengages, they are often managing a profound dread of vulnerability or abandonment. These outbursts and retreats are never arbitrary. They function as direct indicators of a person's hidden fragile points. Furthermore, we must recognize that intense reactions hold far more weight than composed declarations. A calm statement is a curated product of the conscious mind, whereas an emotional reflex is an unbidden truth. When someone speaks serenely about their principles, they are merely outlining the reputation they wish to maintain. However, when they react viscerally, they are inadvertently exposing their genuine priorities. An individual who broadcasts self-assurance but lashes out at the slightest critique is actually sheltering a deep-seated inadequacy. Someone who professes total apathy yet responds with possessiveness is revealing a hidden dependency. Likewise, a person who maintains they are transparent but becomes hostile when asked a simple question is protecting a fragile narrative. High emotional stakes indicate high internal importance. The more powerful the response, the closer you have come to a person's psychological foundation. This insight does not suggest that you should intentionally disturb others to gauge their depth. Existence itself provides a constant stream of tension, friction, and unease. Your only task is to witness how people navigate these natural stresses when they inevitably occur. Psychological triggers should be viewed as internal navigation markers rather than mere accidents. A person is only ever triggered in areas where they remain unresolved or unhealed. When a minor remark, a slight delay, a firm boundary, or a simple difference of opinion sparks a reaction that dwarfs the situation, a deeper history is being reawakened. In these moments, the individual is often not responding to the present reality at all, but rather to a historical wound that has been reopened. This explains the phenomenon of disproportionate emotion. The external event is trivial, but the internal resonance is massive. Grasping this concept allows you to interpret others without absorbing their energy, or taking their hostility personally. Their reaction is an autobiography of their own past, not a commentary on your worth. Defensiveness is perhaps one of the most transparent signals an observer can identify. A person in a defensive state is not primarily concerned with upholding the truth, they are concerned with upholding their own self-concept. When an individual is unable to endure being questioned or corrected, even with the utmost gentleness, it reveals that their identity lacks a solid foundation. They are dependent on a very specific, unchallenged story to feel psychologically safe, and any deviation from that story feels like a survival threat. Consequently, defensiveness frequently manifests as irritation, dismissiveness, sarcasm, or an exhaustive attempt to re-explain the situation. The objective is not to find a resolution but to regain a sense of internal equilibrium. When you encounter this wall, you are effectively seeing the exact boundary of someone's ego. Anger, too, is widely misunderstood, often being mistaken for an expression of power. In reality, rage usually signals a desperate attempt to regain a sense of agency that has been lost. People typically become aggressive when something they rely on, such as their authority, their perceived respect, or their need for dominance, is compromised. Anger is a tool used to force a situation back into a predictable or controllable state. This is precisely why it frequently surfaces when boundaries are established. An individual who responds with hostility to a reasonable limit is exposing a sense of unearned entitlement. One who meets a disagreement with fury is uncovering a profound insecurity. Truly secure individuals have no need to use intimidation as a shield, nor do they feel the urge to crush opposing views. Anger simply highlights the specific areas where a person feels most helpless. It is also vital to remember that not every significant reaction is an explosion. Withdrawal is just as communicative as a loud outburst. Some individuals simply vanish when things become difficult, choosing silence and emotional shutdown as their primary defense. This tendency to retreat is often a strategy developed in childhood to avoid the pain of conflict or the risk of rejection. When the internal landscape feels too chaotic or unsafe, the nervous system seeks safety in distance. This behavior points toward fear rather than a lack of interest. An individual who hides instead of engaging in dialogue is typically avoiding the terror of being seen, not a lack of feeling. Once again, the physical habit of retreating carries far more weight than whatever justification is provided after the fact. The secret to decoding these emotional truths without becoming entangled in them lies in maintaining a state of objective distance. This does not mean you must physically walk away, but rather that you maintain a psychological buffer. You do not need to participate in the argument, you do not need to fix their mood, and you certainly do not need to match their intensity. You simply observe. Take note of what specific event initiated the shift, the level of intensity that followed, and how long it takes for the individual to return to a baseline state. Over time, these emotional architectures become increasingly obvious. You will notice that some people erupt and settle quickly, while others harbor silent bitterness for days, and some swing wildly between states. These recurring patterns provide you with an accurate map of how reliable and emotionally stable a person truly is, allowing you to move through the world with a clear and unclouded perspective. The acquisition of emotional awareness is a profound gift that fundamentally alters your experience of reality. Once you master the art of decoding visceral responses, the bewilderment that once defined your social interactions begins to dissolve. You find yourself no longer plagued by the question of why an individual behaved in a specific manner, because you now perceive the exact internal vulnerability that their reaction was designed to shield. This depth of understanding grants you the power of choice. You can decide the appropriate level of intimacy to maintain, what parts of yourself to disclose, and which behaviors warrant your engagement. In this state, emotions cease to be a source of chaos and instead transform into a stream of precise, revealing data. With this heightened sensitivity, you start to see the human landscape with a level of transparency that spoken language could never provide. Chapter 4: The Eloquence of the Void. Furthermore, We must recognize that silence often carries far more weight than the most eloquent speech. The majority of people find a lack of noise deeply unsettling, and they instinctively rush to saturate it with anecdotes, justifications, or nervous humor. To them, silence feels like a form of exposure. It strips away the protective layer of conversation and forces their focus inward. This very discomfort is a testament to the inherent power of the unspoken. Silence is never truly empty, it is a dense field of information. In the study of human conduct, what is omitted is frequently more significant than what is articulated. While words can be polished and rehearsed to perfection, silence possesses a natural gravity. It lays bare hesitation, avoidance, and true intent without the need for a single phrase. When you learn to interpret the stillness, you begin to perceive others at a level that bypasses their conscious defenses. The primary function of silence is that it effectively removes the social script. While speech facilitates a performance, a sudden pause in dialogue eliminates the opportunity to actively manage another person's perception. In the absence of verbal charm or quick explanations, all that remains is physical presence, posture, microexpressions, and timing. There is a meaningful distinction between those who can inhabit a silence with ease and those who become restless or feel the need to over-explain. A person's comfort with quietude is often an indicator of their internal equilibrium, whereas an inability to remain silent suggests a reliance on external approval. Those who feel a compulsive need to speak are often attempting to steer the narrative of how they are seen. Silence interrupts this endeavor and allows their actual state of being to surface. Moreover, a moment left unanswered creates a unique kind of psychological pressure. Whether it is a pause following a direct question or a steady, non-judgmental gaze, these gaps invite the truth to emerge naturally. Because human beings are wired to fill the void, they often provide unasked for information or offer justifications for their actions before any accusation has even been made. What surfaces in these unpressured moments is frequently far more enlightening than what is gained through direct interrogation. This is why seasoned observers and professionals utilize silence, not as a tool of intimidation, but as a space where honesty can rise of its own accord. Silence does not coerce the truth. It simply makes room for it. The meaning of silence is, of course, highly dependent on its context. When an individual becomes quiet after their behavior is noted, it often indicates a moment of internal recalibration. They realize their facade has been seen. When silence is used as a retreat from communication, it typically signals a dread of being vulnerable or an attempt to avoid accountability. Conversely, a person who remains composed and present in the quiet demonstrates a high degree of emotional self-regulation and confidence. The objective for the observer is to identify the recurring pattern. Is the silence being used for reflection or as a means of punishment? Is it a tool for regulation or a tactic for manipulation? These distinctions are vital for understanding the person before you. In the realm of social influence, silence often shifts the underlying power dynamics. Those who speak with brevity are frequently accorded more respect. Their contributions carry a distinct weight because they are not diluted by unnecessary noise. Their presence commands attention precisely because they are not actively demanding it. This explains why truly confident individuals do not feel the urge to respond immediately. They are not preoccupied with proving their value or filling every gap in the air. On the other hand, those who feel internally unstable often tend to overcommunicate, repeating themselves and seeking constant validation. Silence reveals where genuine power resides, not as a force used against others, but as a steady authority over oneself. Finally, it is essential to distinguish between constructive silence and emotional withdrawal. Silence is a form of presence that lacks noise. It can be attentive, grounded, and deeply intentional. Withdrawal, however, is a state of psychological absence. It is a protective or avoidant maneuver. An individual who is silent but still engaged, listening and observing with care, is displaying a high level of emotional maturity. In contrast, someone who employs silence as a weapon to control or ignore others is revealing a fundamental insecurity. As always, the physical habit provides the true narrative, while the words merely provide the distraction. Applying the practice of silence is not about employing a deceptive tactic. Rather, It is about developing an appreciation for what the absence of noise naturally discloses. You do not need to manufacture awkward tension to see the truth. The rhythm of daily existence already provides a surplus of natural pauses, delays, and quiet intervals. Your responsibility is simply to witness how individuals navigate these moments. Do they frantically offer reassurance? Do they retreat into a defensive posture? Or do they remain composed and rooted in the present? These reactions are not arbitrary. They are mirrors of a person's internal comfort with the unknown and their level of self-reflection. When you cease the habit of filling the void yourself, your own perspective shifts. You stop trying to manipulate how others perceive you, you abandon the need for redundant explanations, and you move beyond impulsive reactions to become a disciplined observer. Furthermore, embracing silence serves as a powerful shield for your own emotional vitality. By allowing a pause to exist, you prevent yourself from rushing to resolve misunderstandings that are not your burden to carry. You no longer overextend your energy to maintain a surface-level comfort for others. Nor do you feel obligated to volunteer justifications just to soothe someone else's internal agitation. By letting the moment speak for itself, you create a sanctuary of emotional safety. You ensure that the responsibility for a conversation remains a shared endeavor rather than a solo performance. In this stillness, you find a level of clarity that noise frequently obscures. The individual who is at peace with silence possesses a significant advantage in any interaction. Such a person is capable of detecting the smallest micro-reactions, a shift in vocal frequency, a change in physical stance, or a flicker of hesitation. They are not easily swayed or distracted by the surrounding clamor. This state of being does not imply a cold or distant nature. On the contrary, it signifies a heightened state of presence. Silence effectively decelerates an interaction, and when things slow down, the truth is finally given the space it needs to surface. In a society characterized by relentless chatter, the capacity to remain still without unease is an exceptional skill. Silence does not need to shout for attention. It commands it with a quiet, undeniable authority. Once you grasp this, you begin to perceive messages that spoken language is fundamentally incapable of carrying. Chapter 5: The Mirror of Indirect Interaction. One of the most infallible methods for decoding a person's character has almost nothing to do with how they interact with you directly. Instead, it is found in how they conduct themselves around those from whom they have nothing to gain. This is the arena where human conduct is at its most transparent. When an individual seeks something from you, whether it be your approval, a professional opportunity, or emotional comfort, they are typically presenting their most polished self. They appear focused, agreeable, and remarkably patient because there is a clear incentive for that behavior. However, that calculated intentionality often evaporates when there is no longer a benefit on the line. How a person treats a service worker, a subordinate, a stranger, or a former associate reveals their fundamental nature more accurately than any direct interaction ever could, precisely because in those instances, no performance is required. It is a common reality that courtesy is frequently a conditional strategy rather than a core trait. Many individuals are polite only because they recognize when politeness will yield a return. They understand when kindness will be noted by those who matter and when restraint will safeguard their reputation. However, the true test occurs when social leverage is removed from the equation. Does their respect endure when there is no audience to witness it? Does their patience hold firm when they are faced with a minor inconvenience? Does their empathy remain steady when the power dynamic is uneven? These specific moments strip away the motivation to act, leaving only the raw character beneath. Someone who maintains a standard of respect across all contexts is disclosing a deeply rooted integrity, whereas someone who is selectively kind is disclosing a mindset of calculation. While such calculation is not always born of ill intent, it is nevertheless a vital piece of information. Furthermore, we must address the pervasive myth that someone is different when they are with you. One of the most frequent forms of self-deception is the belief that an individual's negative patterns do not apply to your specific bond. People often rationalize toxic behavior by claiming that they alone see a hidden, softer side of a person. While it is true that people adapt their personas based on the nature of a relationship, adaptation is not the same as a fundamental transformation of character. If an individual habitually dismisses others, resorts to manipulation, or evades accountability, that blueprint exists within them regardless of how they are treating you at this moment. These traits may not manifest in your direction immediately. They may wait for the arrival of stress, the comfort of long-term familiarity, or a change in circumstances. However, they will eventually surface. Character is not altered by proximity, it is simply revealed by the passage of time. Furthermore, it is essential to scrutinize the manner in which an individual discusses those who are absent from the room. Does their narrative overflow with scorn? Do they take pleasure in highlighting the fragilities of others? Do they consistently cast themselves as the persecuted party in every anecdote? The way a person recounts the actions of others is a direct reflection of their own internal perspective. An individual who perpetually finds fault in everyone else is effectively practicing the script they will eventually use to describe you. Those who disregard the privacy of others will inevitably treat your own secrets with the same lack of care. Speech concerning the character of others serves as a dress rehearsal for their future conduct toward you. True character is revealed by how respect flows downward, rather than how it is directed upward. Nearly anyone can perform respect for those in positions of authority. People are naturally accommodating to those with high status and meticulous with those who hold influence over their future. Consequently, being polite to a superior reveals almost nothing about a person's soul. What truly carries weight is how they interact with those they have no reason to fear. How an individual behaves when they possess a clear advantage uncovers their fundamental ethical foundation. A person who exercises power with a gentle touch demonstrates genuine self-mastery, whereas one who uses influence to overwhelm others exposes deep-seated insecurity. You do not need to speculate on how someone might change their treatment of you in the years to come. You simply need to witness how they currently manage those who have no power over them. The tendency to excuse these recurring patterns is often a sign of deep emotional investment. When we overlook these glaring signals, it is rarely due to a lack of perception. It is because admitting the truth would necessitate a painful psychological shift. It would mean relinquishing our admiration, our optimism, or the cherished belief that we are the unique exception to their rules. To avoid this discomfort, the mind begins to fabricate context. We convince ourselves they were merely under temporary pressure, that their words were taken out of context, or that they were simply having a difficult day. Once again, the act of rationalization replaces the act of observation. While an isolated incident may be worthy of grace, a consistent pattern is a permanent part of their architecture. The most precise method for evaluating another person is to observe their conduct across a variety of environments. Witness how they carry themselves when they are showered with praise, but also how they respond when they are challenged, ignored, or placed in total control. Consistency across these various states is a hallmark of genuine integrity. On the other hand, marked shifts in personality suggest a person who operates based on the roles they are playing rather than a stable inner core. This process does not require you to sit in judgment. It is a matter of calibrating your expectations. There is no need for confrontation or dramatic accusations. You simply acknowledge the evidence presented and modify the level of trust, intimacy, or responsibility you are willing to invest in that specific connection. Cultivating this level of transparency does not require you to become cynical or resentful. On the contrary, it requires a steady clarity. You can identify someone's limitations without harboring bitterness, and you can acknowledge their behavior without turning them into a villain. Most individuals act out of early conditioning rather than conscious harmful intent. They are driven by fear more often than by malice. However, maintaining compassion does not require you to remain blind to reality. You can be inherently kind without being foolishly naive. You can offer understanding without leaving yourself vulnerable to harm. You can recognize a pattern without feeling a compulsive need to repair it. Ultimately, there is an immense sense of relief that comes with accurate perception. When you finally stop believing that people will be different specifically with you, your internal world becomes much more stable. You are no longer blindsided by the predictable. You cease overinvesting in people who cannot return the energy, and you stop taking personally the behaviors that are actually systemic to their character. You begin to engage with individuals exactly as they are, rather than as the exceptions you hoped they would be. This grounded, unreactive accuracy is one of the most potent expressions of emotional intelligence. Once you have seen how a person treats the world at large, the mystery of how they will eventually treat you is solved. Furthermore, we must recognize that insecurity is one of the few psychological forces that can never remain concealed for an extended period. While individuals can meticulously curate their reputations, practice the appearance of confidence, and adopt a veneer of charm or authority, insecurity will inevitably escape. It manifests in vocal inflections, the timing of responses, the need for dominance, and the habit of comparison. Crucially, it does not surface when circumstances are favorable. Instead, it reveals itself the moment a person's sense of value is even slightly compromised. Grasping the nature of this force is vital for accurate perception, as insecure conduct is frequently mislabeled as charisma or leadership, when in truth, it is merely a loud attempt to drown out internal doubt. The distinction between genuine self-assurance and deep-seated insecurity is found in the level of internal stillness. True confidence is inherently tranquil. It feels no compulsion to broadcast its presence or to rush toward a proof of its own worth. Those who are secure are entirely comfortable with silence, differences of opinion, and the natural delays of life, as they do not perceive a lack of immediate agreement as a personal threat. Conversely, the insecure individual views the world as a volatile landscape. Because their self-esteem is tethered to external approval, any disruption in that validation feels like a survival crisis. Consequently, their internal instability often poses as intensity, vocalized through aggressive opinions, an uncompromising certainty, or unnecessary displays of dominance. These are not reflections of internal power, but frantic efforts to reinforce a crumbling self-image. A compulsive need for control is perhaps the most frequent leak of a fragile psyche. Insecure individuals feel a desperate urge to micromanage outcomes, people, and the stories told about them. They find uncertainty intolerable and utilize control as a sedative for their anxiety. This behavior often manifests as the interruption of conversations, the correction of trivialities, a persistent need to be right, or the unnecessary direction of others. The underlying objective is not productivity, but emotional reassurance. An individual who feels internally grounded has no need to exert external force. They possess the self-trust required to adapt to whatever unfolds. Control, therefore, is an admission of fear rather than a mark of authority. Moreover, the habit of comparison serves as a mirror into a conflicted inner world. A secure person does not move through life measuring their stature against those around them. They may acknowledge differences, but they do not feel diminished by them. The insecure person, however, exists in a state of perpetual comparison. They are hyper-aware of social rank, they track who receives credit, and they feel a sense of peril in the success of others. This conflict typically surfaces through subtle, protective reactions, the downplaying of a peer's triumph, the redirection of a dialogue toward their own feats, or the mocking of traits they secretly covet. Insecurity transforms the achievements of others into a painful reflection of what they feel they lack. Disproportionate reactions serve as another significant indicator. When a piece of feedback results in immediate defensiveness, or when a simple boundary triggers a wave of hostility, the response is rarely about the external event. Instead, it is about the internal nerve that has been touched, be it their sense of worth or their carefully managed public persona. While a secure individual can absorb a moment of discomfort without their entire identity collapsing, the insecure person perceives discomfort as a direct threat to their existence. This fundamental difference in how one processes unease dictates the entire rhythm of their social interactions. Finally, we must examine why insecurity is so often misidentified as strength. In many environments, the loudest voice is confused for leadership, and an air of absolute certainty is mistaken for high intelligence. However, these facades are brittle and tend to shatter under prolonged pressure. Insecure individuals typically have an allergic reaction to accountability. They resist constructive criticism and work tirelessly to deflect responsibility onto others. They are willing to sacrifice personal and professional growth to protect a static image of themselves. True strength, however, requires no such armor. It is characterized by the ability to endure exposure and remain standing. To identify insecurity in another does not necessitate a critical heart. Rather, it requires a commitment to neutrality. There is no obligation to label, confront, or diagnose the individual before you. You simply cultivate the habit of noting recurring habits. Does this person possess an insatiable need for external validation? Do they appear to struggle whenever their perspective is questioned? Do they exhibit powerful reactions to even the most trivial challenges? These quiet observations permit you to calibrate your level of intimacy, trust, and future expectations. One cannot logically expect emotional consistency from a foundation of psychological fragility, nor should one anticipate humility from an individual whose primary focus is the preservation of their ego. This is not a moral judgment, it is a necessary form of realism. Furthermore, we must address the delicate balance between compassion and psychological distance. Insecurity is almost always the legacy of earlier life experiences, rejection, neglect, or profound instability. Recognizing this history can soften your perspective without blinding you to current realities. Compassion, however, does not demand proximity. You can understand the roots of someone's insecurity without being forced to absorb the fallout of their actions. You can feel empathy for their struggle without positioning yourself in the path of their volatility. In this context, boundaries are not meant as punishments. They are essential forms of self-protection. The individual who possesses internal security gains a distinct and quiet advantage. When you are grounded, the insecurity of others becomes visible without becoming contagious. You do not mirror their frantic intensity, you refuse to engage in their games of comparison, and you feel no urge to compete for the validation they so desperately seek. You remain unshakable. This steady presence is often disarming, as it effectively removes the emotional fuel that insecure behavior requires to persist. Most importantly, this stance allows you to perceive the world with total clarity, recognizing that insecurity always reveals its true face eventually. Once you can decode the signals beneath the social noise, the behaviors that once seemed erratic and unpredictable become entirely transparent. This insight grants you mastery, not over the lives of others, but over your own internal response to them. Chapter 7: The Crucible of Stress. Pressure achieves what comfort never can. It strips away the rehearsed persona. It causes the social performance to collapse and forces true priorities to the surface. When life is flowing smoothly, an individual can sustain almost any image they desire. They can appear infinitely patient, remarkably generous, and perfectly composed. However, the arrival of genuine pressure, be it through strict deadlines, interpersonal conflict, personal loss, or deep uncertainty, forces the nervous system to take command. In that critical moment, conduct becomes honest. Stress does not manufacture character, it merely exposes what was already there. This is why the most profound insights into human nature are gained not during the calm of a pleasant dialogue, but during the heat of a shared struggle. Under the weight of pressure, the human brain transitions from a state of reflection to a state of reaction. There is simply no longer enough time to manage another's perception, or enough mental energy to filter one's responses. The mind instinctively defaults to its most practiced state, habit, instinct, and long-term conditioning. Some individuals become exceptionally focused and decisive under strain, while others become brittle and defensive. Some choose avoidance, while others attempt to exert total control. These behaviors are not conscious choices made in the moment. They are deeply ingrained responses that, because they were learned over time, are destined to repeat. Furthermore, emotional maturity is never truly measured by how someone behaves when circumstances are favorable. It is measured by their response when their expectations are shattered. Do they assume responsibility for their role, or do they immediately seek a target for blame? Do they prioritize clear communication, or do they retreat into silence? Do they possess the ability to regulate their own emotions, or do they project their internal chaos onto everyone in the room? An emotionally mature individual experiences stress internally and manages it with dignity. Those who lack this maturity externalize their stress, creating unnecessary conflict or demanding constant reassurance to soothe their own agitation. High-pressure moments reveal whether a person can hold their own discomfort without burdening those around them. Finally, we must recognize that pressure tests values rather than rhetoric. Many people speak with great confidence about their commitment to integrity, loyalty, or accountability. However, a value is never proven through speech, it is only tested when adhering to it carries a significant personal cost. Pressure introduces that cost. In moments of duress, people are forced to choose between personal comfort and their principles, between convenience and their responsibilities, and between honesty and self-preservation. While these choices may appear subtle, such as shifting a minor blame or avoiding a necessary but difficult talk, their subtlety does not diminish their weight. The patterns formed under pressure define a person's trustworthiness far more accurately than any verbal declaration they will ever make. Conflict serves as a condensed manifestation of psychological strain. It effectively bypasses social pleasantries and uncovers the true mechanics of how an individual manages a difference of opinion. One must observe whether they prioritize active listening or immediate dominance. Do they pursue mutual understanding or an ego-driven victory? Do they remain rooted in the facts or do they resort to emotional escalation? The manner in which a person engages in a dispute provides a map of their thought process when they feel personally threatened. Those who find disagreement intolerable often conflate opposition with a personal rejection of their worth. Consequently, their responses are fueled by a primitive fear rather than objective logic. Conversely, those who maintain their composure during a confrontation are not exhibiting indifference. Rather, they are demonstrating self-regulation. They possess the rare and significant capacity to decouple their personal identity from their opinions. This specific trait stands as one of the most definitive markers of profound psychological resilience. Furthermore, the introduction of a deadline acts as a diagnostic tool for an individual's priorities. When time becomes a scarce resource, people invariably disclose what they value most. One should take note of whether they honor their existing commitments, or attempt to renegotiate them without prior communication. Do they maintain their presence or do they vanish when the workload increases? Do they master their stress or allow it to dictate their conduct? Reliability under pressure is the true measure of dependability. An individual who consistently fulfills their obligations during periods of duress is genuinely reliable. In contrast, someone who falters under minor strain is unlikely to transform into a stable partner in the future. Stress does not manufacture unreliability, it simply clarifies whether a foundation of reliability ever existed. It is a common error to rationalize away poor behavior by citing the presence of pressure. Phrases like, "They were simply overwhelmed," or "They didn't truly mean it," serve to soothe the observer but do not alter the reality of the actions taken. While stress provides the context for why a behavior occurred, it does not erase the impact of that behavior. If an environment of pressure consistently leads to disrespect, evasion, or hostility, then that specific reaction is a permanent component of that person's behavioral blueprint. One can understand the context without being forced to ignore the reality of the pattern. There is no necessity to intentionally provoke stress to witness these revelations. Life, by its very nature, exerts pressure through failed projects, shifting plans, and inevitable disagreements. Your objective is not to act as a tester of others, but to remain a vigilant witness to their natural responses. Do they work to stabilize the environment, or do they contribute to its destabilization? Do they assume ownership of the situation, or do they search for an exit? Do they gravitate toward a resolution, or do they amplify the surrounding chaos? These observations provide the data necessary to adjust your levels of trust with intelligence and foresight. Maintaining your own composure during a crisis grants you a distinct psychological advantage. By remaining calm, you create a state of clarity that allows you to see exactly who panics, who resorts to manipulation, and who remains steadfast. This stillness creates a powerful contrast, and it is in that contrast that the truth is revealed. This practice does not involve the suppression of feeling, it involves refusing to let feeling dictate your external actions. The disciplined observer does not absorb the surrounding turmoil, they analyze it. Ultimately, pressure reveals the person who remains once comfort has been stripped away. It uncovers not the individual they claim to be at their peak, but the default version of themselves that emerges when control begins to slip. Once you embrace this understanding, your expectations become grounded in reality. You are no longer blindsided by a person's collapse or disappointed by their avoidance. You begin to perceive the internal architecture beneath the social surface. Pressure removes the mask, leaving you with the raw reality of the individual before you. This quiet and precise knowledge empowers you to navigate your relationships with transparency rather than illusion. Indeed, maintaining clarity under pressure is the ultimate form of personal power. Chapter 8: The Mirage of Perception. The prevailing assumption is that we misjudge others due to a lack of sufficient data. We often tell ourselves that if we had possessed more facts, or if the other person had been more forthcoming, we would have seen the truth sooner. However, the fundamental reason for misjudgment is not a deficit of information, but a distortion of the information we already have. Human perception is never a neutral lens, it is a complex filter constructed from emotion, memory, personal aspirations, deep-seated fears, and subjective values. Unless you gain an understanding of these internal filters, you will perpetually see others not as they truly exist, but as your mind has quietly redesigned them to fit your own expectations. The most powerful distortion of reality is the phenomenon of projection. This occurs when you unconsciously assume that others possess the same internal architecture of thought, feeling, and morality that you do. You essentially interpret their movements through your own framework rather than theirs. If you are naturally transparent, you assume others are too. If you are inherently devoted, you expect the same in return. While this feels like a reasonable and humane way to interact, it is actually the most direct path to a total misjudgment of character. Projection is seductive because it maintains a sense of cosmic order, allowing you to believe that the world operates under a universal set of rules. However, human conduct does not adhere to a single ethical script, it follows the dictates of individual conditioning. People are not necessarily flawed for being different from you, but they become a source of danger when you assume a similarity that is fundamentally non-existent. Furthermore, we must distinguish between genuine perception and the influence of hope. Hope is a creative force. It fills the gaps of a person's character with idealized possibilities and offers generous interpretations for ambiguous actions. It is the mechanism that transforms a recurring pattern into a series of exceptions. When you are emotionally invested in a specific outcome or a version of a person, your vision inevitably bends to accommodate that desire. You instinctively downplay the actions that contradict your hope and amplify the words that support it. Hope possesses the unique ability to make verbal promises sound louder than physical evidence. Because hope is associated with optimism and kindness, people rarely stop to question its validity, failing to realize that it is a lens that fundamentally warps the truth. Interestingly, many people misjudge others because familiarity provides a false sense of security, even when that familiarity is painful. The human psyche is drawn to what it recognizes. Early emotional templates, whether they were formed in childhood or through previous relationships, act as internal blueprints. When a new person fits these existing molds, they feel right and known, even if the blueprint itself is defined by neglect or inconsistency. This explains the tragic paradox where individuals repeatedly trust those who let them down while remaining wary of those who are actually reliable. Healthy conduct can feel foreign and unpredictable, triggering an internal alarm, while familiar dysfunction feels predictable and therefore safe. This leads to a cycle where the dependable are undervalued and the erratic are endlessly forgiven. Another significant warning sign of distorted perception is the act of over-explaining. There is a meaningful difference between observing behavior and constantly interpreting it. While exhaustive analysis feels like a productive way to understand someone, it is often a signal that you are resisting what the behavior is already clearly demonstrating. Truth generally does not require a constant translation service. When an individual's actions align with their words, acceptance is effortless. It is only when those two things contradict each other that an explanation is demanded, and it is within that explanation that misjudgment finds its fuel. We must also acknowledge that emotional attachment serves as a direct barrier to accuracy. The deeper your connection to someone, the more difficult it becomes to maintain an objective view. Attachment functions as a biological bias that magnifies virtues while minimizing defects, reframing harmful actions as complexities or misunderstandings. This is not a failure of character. It is a function of a nervous system that prioritizes connection over data. Seeing the truth clearly can sometimes threaten the very survival of the bond, so the mind compromises its perception to keep the attachment intact. This is precisely why a certain amount of psychological distance, not coldness, but the space to witness without an agenda, is required to restore clarity. Furthermore, many misjudgments are fueled by a hidden longing to be the exception to someone's rule. There is a powerful ego boost in being the one who is treated well by someone who treats the rest of the world poorly. It feels like an ultimate validation of your own worth. The mind clings to this feeling of being chosen, ignoring the broader evidence of the person's character. However, being the temporary favorite of an unstable individual does not mean you have found security. It simply means you are currently providing a specific utility. Usefulness is a fragile foundation, and it should never be mistaken for genuine safety. Correcting your perception does not require you to adopt a permanent state of suspicion. Instead, it requires you to decelerate your conclusions. It involves a disciplined separation of physical evidence from emotional interpretation, and recurring patterns from singular explanations. Rather than searching for a hidden meaning behind a person's words, focus on the regularity of their actions. Instead of asking why a single event occurred, analyze how frequently that event repeats. These questions move you away from the realm of guesswork and into the realm of objective observation. Ultimately, seeing people with total transparency is not a mystical talent, it is a rigorous discipline. It is the practice of watching without filling the voids, of noticing a pattern without rushing to rescue the person from it, and of allowing reality to exist even when it is disappointing. When you finally discard projection, hope-driven distortion, and emotional bias, your internal world reaches a state of equilibrium. You stop misjudging others not because they have changed their nature, but because you have changed your lens. With accurate perception comes a profound and lasting peace. Confusion was never a result of human complexity. It was the result of seeing others through filters that were never intended to be neutral. Once those filters are removed, the world becomes remarkably easy to read. Behavior, when witnessed without the interference of our own desires, rarely tells a lie. The quiet apprehension that often accompanies the study of human behavior is the fear of losing one's humanity. Many worry that by perceiving others with total transparency, they will inevitably become emotionally numb, distant, or perpetually guarded. This concern, while understandable, is fundamentally misplaced. True clarity does not necessitate coldness, nor does heightened awareness demand a withdrawal from connection. In fact, the reality is quite the opposite. When you cease to misinterpret the actions of those around you, you become more grounded and composed. You gain the capacity to consciously choose the nature of your relationships rather than being driven by blind, impulsive reactions. Furthermore, we must dismantle the false dichotomy between empathy and perception. There is a common misconception that one must choose between being kind and being observant, as if noticing a person's flaws or recurring patterns somehow erodes compassion. However, empathy without the balance of awareness often leads to self-sacrifice, while awareness devoid of empathy results in a cold detachment. The ultimate objective is a state of grounded understanding. This allows you to acknowledge an individual's limitations and wounds without resenting them, or feeling a compulsive need to inhabit their struggle. Emotionally mature individuals recognize that seeing behavior for what it truly is does not constitute a moral judgment. It is simply an acknowledgement of reality. It is also important to realize that emotional coldness is rarely the result of understanding too much. More often, it is a defensive reflex born of being repeatedly hurt in the absence of clarity. When individuals are subjected to betrayal or confusion without the protection of boundaries, they eventually shut down as a means of survival. Mastering the art of reading human behavior prevents this cycle of damage. It empowers you to adjust your expectations and proximity long before significant harm can accumulate. The essential skill in this discipline is the ability to separate. This involves distinguishing between what another person feels and what you are obligated to carry, between their struggles and your perceived duty to fix them, and between what they reveal and what you are willing to tolerate. You are never required to absorb the internal chaos of others simply because you understand its source. You can witness insecurity without accommodating it, and you can identify manipulation without being drawn into its web. This is not an act of coldness, it is an act of containment, the healthy maintenance of your own psychological space. Many individuals mistakenly view boundaries as a form of rejection, fearing that setting a limit is equivalent to withdrawing care or respect. In truth, boundaries are the very structures that allow care to persist without being poisoned by resentment. When you read people with accuracy, you naturally calibrate your proximity to them. You do not entrust deep secrets to a gossip, you do not lean on the unreliable, and you do not seek validation from the inconsistent. This calibration is not a form of emotional cruelty, it is the highest form of emotional intelligence. It is the practice of meeting people exactly where they are, rather than where you wish them to be. Moreover, genuine compassion is always rooted in reality. It does not require you to pretend that a person is different than they are, nor does it ask you to ignore harmful behaviors for the sake of peace. True compassion says, "I see you exactly as you are, and I am choosing the distance at which I will stand." In contrast, illusion is a temporary sedative that eventually collapses under the weight of reality. Compassion, however, is durable because it is honest. One of the most liberating aspects of this clarity is the release of the urge to fix those around you. Once you see behavior accurately, you stop negotiating with a reality that cannot change and stop investing your vitality in unlikely transformations. You cease to confuse a person's distant potential with their current probability, making your interactions significantly more efficient and less draining. Finally, maintaining emotional warmth does not require universal vulnerability. You can be a kind and present listener without inviting every influence into your life or leaving yourself exposed to harm. People who appear cold are often those who have never learned to regulate their closeness, oscillating wildly between oversharing and total isolation. Reading people provides the stability needed to stay steady. When you abandon the habits of projection and over-explanation, a deep calm settles within you. You are no longer responsible for managing the feelings of others or surprised by behaviors that once seemed erratic. This calm is not a sign of indifference, it is the peace that comes from being in total alignment with reality. You are no longer reacting to an imagined version of people, but responding to who they consistently prove themselves to be. This is not coldness, it is the beginning of true wisdom.